please do come over at the end and say hi. All right, so our last session of the day from David Thorstad, who I think we first met when I was in Oxford last year around this time, when I was kind of reaching out to some people at GPI after I've been doing some fairly public beefing with Will McCaskill and those sorts of folks about long-termism, on which I've generally kind of moderated to a certain degree, although as you saw, not that much. But David is this sort of this curious phenomenon in effective altruism where they pay people to criticize them, which is like an ingenious tactic. And one that has produced some really interesting work. In fact, it seems like most of the papers published by GPI are critiques of long-termism rather than arguments for it. And he's been doing really interesting work on bounded rationality. He's just recently started at Vanderbilt, where he is working alongside, obviously he's in philosophy, but he's working alongside Jenny Davis, who's our much beloved, recently departed. I mean, she hasn't died, but from our perspective, it feels like she has. Who has moved to Vanderbilt, where there's lots of interesting stuff happening on AI. And so David has been, he and I have been sort of bouncing ideas back and forth for a bit, often making the same kind of complaint that like the views that we're trying to argue against are just not very well articulated, and they're not published in places where we can find them. And then you have to go on these horrible forums and see all sorts of horrible stuff in order to kind of extract the sort of the pith. So he's been doing like absolute yeoman's work in kind of getting people to formulate his arguments precisely and then responding to them. So he's going to talk about the singularity hypothesis. I'm going to just flag now that after the talk, we're going to have a 5-minute break for people to use the restroom and relax as they need, and then we'll go into Q&A then. But let's get right on with it and welcome David.
Thank you. And since I'm the last, I just wanted to take a minute to thank Seth for bringing us all here. Thank you, Seth. This conference obviously would not have happened without you. And thank you for changing your mind. Not many people do that. As you mentioned last year, you were quite set against this literature and now are in the middle in a position where, you know, you're bringing us all together. And I genuinely appreciate that. And the people that I'm criticizing genuinely appreciate that. Okay, there's a handout. You should all have a handout. I'm a handout guy. There are two classic arguments for catastrophic and usually existential risk from AI. There's the power-seeking argument, which we've discussed, and there's the singularity hypothesis. The singularity hypothesis is classically what you'll see from Nick Bostrom and from Eliezer Yudkowsky in pushing existential risk worries, but the hypothesis did not start with them. A pretty classic statement of the hypothesis, and one of the first, is from I.J. Good in 1966. He said, let an ultra-intelligent machine, we call it superintelligence now, be defined as a machine that can far surpass all the intellectual activities of any human, however clever. Okay, well, designing machines is one of those activities, so an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. So far, so good. There would then unquestionably, this is the first of two turning words. We're also going to see one in instrumental convergence, the word implying. There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of humanity would be left far behind. This is where I'm going to start getting off board. So what do we mean by the singularity hypothesis? We need to be very precise in this space. It's a space in which it's really hard to pin people down. And it's a space in which, frankly, there's a lot of gaslighting. You refute people and they say, no, I didn't say that. And they really did say that. So I'm going to try whenever possible to really pin people down. And if I ever say something and you're like, who said that? I will tell you, you know, I hold myself responsible to that. But I also hold people responsible for what they said. So I'll tell you what the singularity hypothesis is. I'll tell you how it got to be that. And this is a paper about, you know, about that. So first, they've got a self-improvement idea. They've got the idea that artificial agents will soon, if they don't already have it, be able to meaningfully improve their own intelligence. This is, I think, much less far-fetched than it might have seemed. We do use AI in designing hardware. AI does now know how to code fairly well. This is something, if we're not doing already, we probably will do in the future. And then there's a claim of accelerating growth. Of course, AI contributing to its own development will give us growth. That's good. But the thought is that the rate of growth will itself be accelerating. And if you have accelerating growth, what happens? You get quickly a discontinuity. They call it a singularity literally by analogy with crossing the event horizon of a singularity or a black hole. That is, accelerating growth will take us to a discontinuity in human history that is so drastic that it's just completely unlike and almost unforeseeable from anything that's come before. So that's a singularity hypothesis, has these three things. The reason this is linked to AI risk is Bostrom and Yudkowsky discovered you could skip one of the thorniest steps if you had a singularity hypothesis. Namely, something that's radically super intelligent could do with us whatever it would want. As Yudkowsky says, you don't bargain with ants. You want to squish the ants, you squish the ants. You want to leave the ants alone, you leave the ants alone. But the question about the ants' survival is only a question of what we want to do with them. And so to us related to a radical superintelligence, it's only a question of superintelligence motivation. So then we get into these premises like orthogonality, like instrumental convergence about motivations. But the nice thing about going this way is those settle the argument. If you've got the wrong motivations, you've got an existential catastrophe right there. Now, maybe less so than 2 years ago when I was writing this argument, but still, I think very often when I talk to philosophers, I tell them what the singularity hypothesis is, and they say, who held that? Why are you bothering to discuss this? It seems like a pretty fringe view. Let me give you people who have explicitly, in usually article length or better, defended the singularity hypothesis. In philosophy, two heavy hitters, I'm going to be talking about him. Dave Chalmers, very serious guy. He's got a portrait here in the National Gallery. Nick Bostrom, we've had our disagreements, to put it mildly, but a very serious philosopher. Bostrom's written a book about it. Chalmers wrote a paper about it, followed by a special issue with 19 replies, followed by a reply to those replies. Then you say, okay, the AI guys weren't saying it. AIJ Good, of course, did say this in a paper. Stuart Russell also has a book defending this hypothesis. It's pretty similar to the Bostrom book. And Ray Solomonov has a paper advocating for a singularity hypothesis view. When you survey AI researchers, there are some issues with these surveys. Response rate isn't great. You have to water down the singularity a little bit when you ask them. But when you ask serious AI researchers about the basic intelligence explosion argument, you tend to get double-digit agreement or sympathy with the argument. So this is something you're starting to see serious people take seriously. Of course, it was popularized by a science fiction writer. So Werner Vinge in 1993 wrote some very famous essays, and this tends to be a little bit fringier. Was also popularized by Ray Kurzweil, who's a major bigwig at Google, has written a book about the singularity in 2005 and continues to put a very specific date on the singularity. I think it's 2039, and he's not moving that date. We'll see. He actually says some very striking things about how far the singularity is gonna take us, but this is what it is. You see this in the news these days. I talk to my media office. They're very excited about this. They say, look, here's what we're seeing. Popular Mechanics, reasonably serious, says there's a trend. I didn't read it. Don't ask me where the trend is. A trend last year is going to get a singularity in 7 years. 2008, IE Spectrum had an actually really good special issue on the singularity, looking at the arguments, looking at the people. The next one is 2023, the New York Times. Also, the New Yorker did something that year. Silicon Valley confronts the idea the singularity is not just going to happen, it's here. Granted, they're pushing out back a bit. Maybe it's the hype that's out of control, but this was a feature in the New York Times. And I get a bunch of AI newsletters. I don't know if anyone subscribes to Fry AI, but at the bottom of Fry AI, kind of for fun, but kind of seriously, they got a singularity meter. Says how far are we to the singularity? And as of last week, if this Fry singularity meter is to be trusted, we are 45% of the way to the singularity. So this is a thesis that definitely has some currency, that has a subreddit with 2 million subscribers dedicated to it. They don't like me very much. I don't think this is a good way to go. I think I'm very happy we're talking about catastrophic AI risk. I'm willing to talk about existential risk. I do not think that this is the best way into the topic. Oddly, I'm not the only one who's had this thought. We've seen a lot more shifting towards the power-seeking arguments and towards the non-singularity arguments as time went by. But oddly enough, or maybe not oddly, nobody wrote down why we stopped leaning on the singularity so much. So I'm just trying to write down, I think, some of the reasons why many people are a bit skeptical of this view. All right, so we have to be really clear on the singularity hypothesis, and I want to be really clear here. This is a very shifty literature. People said what they said, they meant what they meant. Here's exactly what they said and exactly what they meant. Now, where am I going for this? I'm going for the first scholarly anthology on the topic. That's what you do. The editors, right in the introduction, said there are multiple things called the singularity. There's the economic singularity, there's a technological singularity. What do these all have in common? They said we need to say what the singularity hypothesis means. These were, the first editors of the major anthology. Almost everybody in that anthology echoed this. So, I can give you some citations if we want to squirm here. Here's what a singularity hypothesis is. First, just specify a quantity. I'm going to be talking about technological growth, so intelligence, but if you're doing the economic singularity, this is GDP. Second, you don't just say the quantity is going to grow. Of course, it's going to grow. You say it's going to grow at an accelerating rate, and then you tell me, don't forget to tell me what you mean by an accelerating rate, because some people don't talk about acceleration when they think they are. And then you say it's going to grow at an accelerating rate until we hit a discontinuity. And remember, this has to be a serious discontinuity. This is conceived on analogy with passing the event horizon of a black hole. So when people say we just meant AGI, they did not just mean AGI. And we'll pin them down on that in a second. So, okay, well, how do I tell you which singularity I'm talking about, in particular distinguishes from like the economic singularity, which is, a fringe but serious view in economics? I tell you which quantity I mean, what I mean by accelerating growth, and what I mean by discontinuity. So the quantity is generally going to be thought of as general intelligence. This is something that was in good and is in most of the tradition. Like Cameron said, and like I think Chalmers taught us, if you don't want to do this in terms of general intelligence, you can probably avoid it, but it's usually formulated as a claim about general intelligence as a thing that's going to be growing. I won't read the good again because we've already read the good. So a lot of people want to argue here, and that's fine if you do. You might think there's no cogent notion of general intelligence, or it's a spectrum concept. You might also be worried it's kind of racist because eugenicists were pushing it. That's fine. You might also worry kind of the Bert Dreyfus thing. AI is never going to be intelligent in a meaningful way, or it's never going to get to, enough intelligence that it could self-improve. I think that's fizzled out a little, but if you want to push on that, that's fine. And the odd thing in writing this paper, I found everybody has very different views of intelligence and thinks theirs and only theirs are correct. It's just dealing with referees was a nightmare. Whatever you mean or don't mean by intelligence, that's fine. It's not my term. But we can reformulate the argument with whatever you mean. And if it causes problems, it causes problems for somebody else. Okay, accelerating growth. We need to be very clear here. So I've graphed at the bottom 5 different growth modes. So here we have, on the x-axis is like time, and on the y-axis is the quantity growing, but who labels axes? I'll do it next time, but I forgot to do it in the paper. A very common kind of growth is like a logarithmic growth. It's like a leveling off. Very clearly, this isn't accelerating. Linear growth is usually about the fastest you're going to see over a long period of time, is not accelerating growth. A lot of people have the tendency to talk about exponential growth and accelerating growth. This is, for most people, not accelerating growth. If you like distinctions, this is accelerating in an absolute, not a relative sense, i.e. amount of growth, like in, pounds or units, or intelligence accelerating, but percent, like 2% a year, 2% a year, 2% a year, it's a constant percent. So what's the most famous fact about an exponential? It's its own derivative. That's just definition of exponentials. That's why we think of exponentials as constant growth. You know, the economy grows exponentially 3%, 3%, 3%. This is not accelerating growth. This is constant growth. And why do we really want to distinguish this from accelerating growth is that it's not that fast. So if you think about the economy, we have been growing exponentially for a couple hundred years. It's been pretty cool. But we haven't had this runaway in 2 years or 5 years to, you know, a quadrillion times more economic output than we want. This is not a typical feature of the exponential. Everybody except Dave Chalmers has explicitly said, and I will give you what they said if you want, that by the singularity, by accelerating growth, they mean hyperbolic growth, the kind that goes to a singular, a hyperbola in finite time. An asymptote finite time. So what does hyperbolic growth mean? It just means that the derivative is increasing over time. And the derivative is increasing and increasing and increasing. You do get this runaway, and that's what people have meant by singularity. And again, we don't just need hyperbolic growth for some time. We need hyperbolic growth over sustained time. And this is important. So if you look at, you know, graph D versus graph E, you very often have something that starts out looking exponential hyperbolic, but levels out. Analogy, population growth. 200 years ago, it started growing exponentially. Some people thought hyperbolically. Very famous paper said it just continues. We will have an infinite population in 2061. We didn't. It grew fast. It was nice. We got about 10 times more people than we had, and then it leveled off. And by 2100, we're going to have population start declining again. So we don't just need hyperbolic growth. We need hyperbolic growth over many orders of magnitude. And this is important because if you start looking, for example, at hyperbolic growth in nature, you say, oh, we have like a nuclear chain reaction and it's hyperbolic. And then precisely because it grows so fast, you know, it runs out of material and it stops. So we don't just need hyperfast growth. We need sustained hyperfast growth. Okay, what kind of a discontinuity are we aiming for? So the toned down version you'll see in the academic literature is still pretty striking. Dave Chalmers says we're going until we have accelerating growth, until we get a system that's at least as far beyond the most intelligent human as the most intelligent human is beyond a mouse. Bostrom said a worm, but we'll go with a mouse. The 2012 anthology, again, pretty much everybody was saying this, a level of general intelligence 2 or 3 orders of magnitude greater than the human level. These are not the editors of the anthology, but it's a very prominent paper in the anthology. One more kind of sane description, this one actually from Yudkowsky. Yudkowsky says the technological singularity, we're going for minds orders of magnitude above the humans. So kind of the normal description of what we're going for is merely 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. Remember, not 2 times, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 times stronger than humanity. When you go beyond the philosophical literature, you have some very optimistic statements. So Ray Kurzweil thinks there's a law of accelerating returns. It doesn't just apply to machine intelligence. It's a law that everything shows accelerated returns. Everything shows accelerated returns, and accelerated returns is going to continue in a law-like fashion until non-biological intelligence saturates the matter and energy of the vicinity of our universe with our human machine intelligence. I'll read you once we're not recording. I got some crackpot emailed me like a draft that said exactly that by my email today. You have no idea how many people actually say these things. So that's what the view is. Maybe not the very last Kurzweil thing, but everything else, like I really want to hold them to it. So I started reading this, and I saw a lot of people saying, I don't believe in intelligence, or intelligence is racist, or how could machines have intelligence? But kind of the really obvious pushback that this is a very, 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 very strong growth claim, and we'd like appropriately strong evidence for. Nobody actually wrote that out at paper length. And so I thought, okay, people know this is a pretty strong claim. Let's just write out why it's a pretty strong claim that you might not want to be leaning on in arguments. So the general strategy is a positive and a negative strategy. The positive strategy is I want to give you 5 reasons to think that this claim is probably too strong. Won't imply it's false, but it will imply you owe me a lot of reasons. And then the negative project is, look, the reasons that were being given by serious people like Nick Bostrom, like Dave Chalmers, are not approaching the level of strength that we'd want for a thesis like this. So the first reason for skepticism is just what I said. This is an extraordinary claim. What do I mean by extraordinary? I mean implausible. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you tell me this is physically possible, it's physically possible. You tell me I can't rule it out, I can't rule it out. But none of that is going to get us very far towards belief in this claim. So there's already, before we start making the case for skepticism, a very high burden. And we're going to see, especially in Chalmers, that there's just not that much being done to meet the burden. The second concern is going to be diminishing research productivity. So this is a big deal in economics. This is mostly Chad Jones, and it's the foundation of semi-endogenous growth theory. This is something most macroeconomists take very seriously right now. And we're going to see that this is something that people take seriously in the specific case of Moore's law and computer hardware. The rough analogy here is, imagine you go fishing and you're fishing without replacement. You know, you're not doing catch and release, you're doing catch and don't release. At first, it's great. You're catching all the easy fish. They're hungry, they're dumb, they're close to the surface, they like whatever you're using. But you keep fishing, it gets harder to catch fish. Why is it harder to catch fish? You caught the easy ones. And by the way, there aren't even as many fish anymore. And so the longer you fish, the harder it is. And that's just true of any good way of fishing, because you want to catch the easy fish first. The thought is that idea-generating processes, i.e. research, work the same way. Namely, if you don't want to get fired, you get the low-hanging fruit first, because that's really where you should start. Then you get the harder ones and the harder ones and the harder ones. And so as time goes on, the same amount of improvement in whatever research output you want gets harder and harder in terms of the inputs needed to produce it. The slogan here is good ideas are harder to find. More precisely, take an output measure like computer performance or intelligence, and take a input measure like quality weighted research time, and you need more and more and more inputs like research hours to get the same outputs, like a doubling of machine intelligence. This is thought to happen in most or all sectors of the American economy today. It happens if you ask how much money or how much research does it take to produce a drug, or how to increase crop yields, or to increase lifespans, or to do almost anything. And we'll see this applies in most of the relevant hardware cases too. So this is general dogma, backed by evidence that this is something that should happen pretty quickly to most serious research processes done right. Now you say to me, okay, you haven't said anything about computers. Why would diminishing research productivity apply to computers? And in particular, you say, we have had a doubling and a doubling and a doubling and a doubling of something, namely most hardware measures. So I'll just talk about Moore's law, which is done in terms of, the number of transistors in a fixed area of a dense integrated circuit. But if you want another hardware measure, most of them were showing Moore's law. It was supposed to be every 1 year. Now it's every 2, and now it's a little bit complicated because we don't believe it anymore, but let's just say every 2. And you say, well, where's the diminishing research productivity? We doubled every 2 years. The best, most recent good argument for diminishing returns, by which I mean Chad Jones and colleagues, American Economic Review 2020, uses Moore's law not only as an example of diminishing research productivity, as their star example, and has an entire section in the paper about how we've seen diminishing marginal research productivity throughout the history of Moore's law. They give us a bunch of models. Their main model estimates we saw an 18-fold drop in research productivity in semiconductors over the last 60 years. I think 55 years actually, and their models range from, I think, an 8-fold drop to like a 500-fold drop. It's good. It's an American Economic Review. I can give you their numbers. They're pretty good. So turning the page and then turning it back, I apologize. It just couldn't fit in the page. So there's their model. You've got, this time on the bottom that's progressed, and you've got this double axis thing. So you've got the growth rate of, say, transistor count. If you want to double every 2 years, is 35% a year. Okay, that was constant. What changed? The number of researchers we needed on their modal model, and some of them are a lot worse, went up by 18 times. So turning the page back, what do people think about Moore's law? There's 2 expert opinions on Moore's law. There's the thought that it ended 5 years ago, and there's a thought that it'll end by 2030. And those are the 2 camps. Why do people think this? Because it's just getting so darned expensive. Before Sam Altman, I would tell you a semiconductor plant costs billions of dollars to make. Now I'll remind you, we're asking for $5 to $7 trillion to get all the chips we need. So this idea of let's just throw more and more and more inputs into the problem in a self-fulfilling prophecy to keep doubling, diminishing productivity has to keep up when you run out of resources. So that's the main worry. Another worry is bottlenecks. And this is also coming from The Economist. So this is a, National Bureau of Economics working paper. Let me say something kind of very obvious and then try to make it interesting. Namely, if you have a process that's got a bunch of steps, the process can't be any faster than its slowest step. That is a trivial theorem. Why does this matter? Well, if you want to speed up the process a little, you can speed up, some of the steps and not others. But if you want to speed it up 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times or 1,000,000,000 times or a quadrillion times, you need to be able to do that to every one of the steps. Because if one of the steps resists speed up or improvement on that order of magnitude, it's just going to get you. And remember, we only need one bottleneck to get in the way of a singularity kind of view. Even if it takes a couple of years, this is already off the time scale the singularity folks are giving us. And when we have a lot of bottlenecks, we tend to be in a lot of trouble. What could bottleneck us? Energy. Remember Sam Altman? I'm quoting mildly accelerationist people, so you won't say I'm cherry picking, says we need a fundamental energy revolution to get to AGI, let alone singularity. He's currently investing in cold fusion startups is how we're going to get the energy. Physical resources, hardware assembly. Okay, even if we wanted to build all these chips, we need new plants to build them. Those don't come up overnight. Things like transistor size, the old game for Moore's law is pretty much up. Let's make it smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, now they're 10 times as wide as an average atom. What are you going to do? Keep making them smaller? This just doesn't work anymore. Heat dissipation is a major problem. So if you go with the old game, okay, you're putting twice as much and twice as much and twice as much heat in the same area. How do you get rid of it is suddenly a problem. Software is a problem. But, put in your favorite bottleneck. And remember, the singularity folks need to be able to either have no bottlenecks or quickly overcome the bottlenecks in a sustained way over many orders of magnitude improvement. And this is a pretty strong claim. Similar point is about physical limits. So I think of this as differing from bottlenecks in the sense of being either permanent or relatively more permanent. Not, it's going to take a year or two, but this is a really much more lasting kind of a problem. But it's going to be much the same problem. Namely, have, things like resources, like energy, like chips, like metals. And if you say you're going to get a quadrillion times more hardware power in 11 years or even 100 years, you have to say where the energy is going to come from. And when you're talking about 10 times or 100 times more energy, fine, we'll build more plants. But if you're talking about a quadrillion more times energy, don't just tell me hackers in a basement are going to do something, then tell me where they're going to get that much power from. And then things like transistor size. So the old game of shrinking transistors is not going to take us there. Finally, when people argue for the singularity, they talk about hardware. And this is good because hardware, at least for a while, was showing exponential growth, although not hyperbolic growth, has never shown hyperbolic growth. But remember, they don't need to talk about hardware capacities. They have to talk about intelligence. And this is important because it's not at all obvious that these are the same thing. Maybe one way of putting the point is Moore's law. We got 33 million times more transistors in the same area. So if you think this correlates with intelligence, you'd say we'd gotten 33 million times more intelligence over this period. I think that's a little bit implausible, but maybe let me put it as a disjunction. Either that's implausible, or if that's not, you need to tell me why another 33 million times increase in intelligence should be frightening once we realize that that's what's meant by intelligence. More generally, just tell me whatever you mean by intelligence, or tell me whatever you want to use as a measure of intelligence. I am skeptical that it increases in lockstep with hardware. I'll just use 5 things because these are the 5 things I have good evidence for. But if you want to use something else, use something else. So gameplay, I wasn't sure if I should use chess or Go, so I'm going to use both. Problem solving, so I didn't give you them here, but the paper that I'm citing looks at 3 things. It looks at temperature forecasting, I think I did do. It looks at ability to find underground oil reservoirs, and it looks at protein folding. Maybe these are good measures or correlates of intelligence. If not, just give me something else. Every one of these areas, turning the page, we've had a very clear trend, exponential progress in hardware leading to linear increases in performance measures. So this with chess and Go, it's log linear. Temperature prediction, it doesn't matter if you're predicting weather 3 days out, 4 days out, 5, 6, 7, loss has declined in a linear way as we've had an exponential growth. in hardware. So turning the page back, I'm sorry, is the only problem with LaTeX instead of slides. Hyperbolic growth is already strong enough. We've only seen exponential growth in hardware. We've never seen hyperbolic growth. But remember, even hyperbolic hardware growth is probably not enough to get what we need. We need hyperbolic intelligence growth. And that might actually be much faster than merely hyperbolic hardware growth. Okay, so these are some reasons to be skeptical of the singularity. To recap, it's an extraordinary claim. Diminishing research productivity should pinch us. Got bottlenecks and/or physical limitations. And remember, we have to be improving intelligence, not just hardware. Doesn't prove it's false, but it does mean you owe me a pretty good argument. The first classic paper disappointed me a little bit. Dave Chalmers is a very serious guy. I like the second half of this paper. It does great philosophy of mind. The argument for the singularity is based on what he calls the proportionality thesis. Increases in intelligence of a system always lead to proportionate increases in the ability to design an intelligent system. You kick up the intelligence 10%, it can design something that is 10% more intelligent than it otherwise would, and so on and so forth. So if you take intelligence as research inputs and intelligence as research outputs, this is just the flat denial of diminishing research productivity combined with, the denial of all these other things. It's a pretty surprising thing, and it's not, an armchair thing. It's something we want to argue for. He doesn't argue for this view. He says it. And then he considers the objection that you might not believe the proportionality thesis is already a little bit strange. Like, why are we considering the objection? You might not believe the main thing driving the argument. And here's what he says in response to the objection. This is really the only argument for proportionality in the paper. First, we just get an enthusiastic restatement. If anything, 10% increase in intelligence will get us all sorts of intellectual breakthroughs. Next generation increase in intelligence that are significantly greater than 10%. Okay, that's a statement of the view, it's not an argument. Here's the argument. It's in bold. It's one sentence. Even among humans, you take a small difference in design capacities, say between Turing and someone like me. That gives you a large difference in the systems that are designed, say between a Turing computer and nothing much. And so that's supposed to be the illustration of proportionality held in Turing's day versus other people. The three problems. So problem one, and I think this is really all you need to know, is just get out a ruler. This is an extremely strong growth claim being made. Before you heard the reason for skepticism, this is the kind of thing you need books and books and books to argue for. We're given one sentence about Turing. This is not taking seriously the argumentative burdens on an argument like this. And this is the kind of argument that would never pass muster at a serious empirical journal. They've not gotten these papers into empirical journals except the Solomon. And, if they're not willing to take this kind of an argument, I don't know why we would have like a philosophical debate about this particular argument. I will pick on this argument. I feel kind of unfair. I mean, of course, a one-sentence argument doesn't work, but if you want me to tell you why it doesn't work, here's why it doesn't work. The first is locality. So he's telling you not about a curve. He's telling you about one point on the curve. That's already bad. But also he's telling you about the first point on the curve, Turing versus, people at the beginning. And if you flip back to the growth curves I've graphed, the problem is a lot of these are accelerating at the beginning. So in particular, hyperbolic growth is taking off at the beginning. Exponential growth is taking off at the beginning. Logistic growth is taking off at the beginning. Logarithmic growth is taking off at the beginning. So the debate can't be about the beginning of the curve. It's about the end of the curve. And it's especially about the end of the curve because all the arguments I just made are about the end of the curve. Research productivity diminishes eventually. You get bottlenecked eventually. You run out of resources eventually. So the debate is not, can we start fast? The debate is, can we stay fast? And so this is not the right example to be using. It's also, so I read Bostrom when I meant Chalmers. Sorry to both of them. Now the complaint is we're equivocating. So remember, proportionality needs to be same thing in, same thing out. If you kick up intelligence by 10%, you kick up the intelligence of the resulting system by 10%. So then that system can make something 10% better and 10%. But that's not what he said. He said you kick up the design ability of Turing above somebody else. And that kicks up the intelligence of the resulting system. So two ways to see that's the wrong way to go. Okay, you've got design ability and intelligence design ability, oops. How does that work? And in particular, that really doesn't work. Because if the thought is supposed to be that, what gave Turing all this design ability is his massive intelligence. Well, he wasn't the smartest person around. There were plenty of less smart people who might have had his design ability. There are plenty of more smart people who didn't. So this is not a great way of pumping the idea that intelligence gives you the ability to design intelligence systems. It's probably a good way of pumping the idea that general intelligence alone is not what you need to be designing intelligence. Okay, that's the argument. We can talk about that if we'd like, but I want to move on maybe to the Bostrom. I've had my differences with Nick Bostrom in terms of behavior, in terms of arguments. I will say this. If it is possible to write a scientifically grounded book on superintelligence, it's probably the Bostrom book. He's at least trying to make arguments, to engage with specific technologies. I think he's being a lot more concrete and more specific and being more argument-driven than Chalmers. So to his credit, Bostrom has an entire chapter of his book, chapter 4, on kinematics of an intelligence explosion, i.e. how fast it's going to be and why it's probably hyperbolic. He doesn't want to call this a singularity style view, but just for very particular reasons that aren't related to, the definition of the singularity I've given you. So, okay, let's read the chapter 4 of Bostrom. He makes arguments. He makes, I think, 6 of them. I'm, taking anything that could possibly be an argument, and let's talk about the argument. Before we do, let's just get the Bostrom framework on board. I'll give you his words and I'll translate them into mine. So how fast does intelligence grow? It grows with optimization power, i.e. quality weighted research inputs. So when I told you about research productivity, I called it research inputs. He calls it optimization power. Fine. Then what drags it down? Well, the amount of research inputs you need to get a fixed output. I would call that, the inverse of research productivity. He calls it recalcitrance. Fine. With that definition, we just designed it so intelligence growth is optimization power over recalcitrance. So what do we need to get? Sorry, I forgot to talk about hyperbolas versus exponential growth. So to get this to be hyperbolic, we need something a little bit stronger than Chalmers. So if we have, constant recalcitrance, we're going to get an exponential in the Chalmers sense. And if we have like a proportionality thesis here, right, proportionality gives you 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%. That's what the economy is doing right now, except 10 instead of 3. To make this go hyperbola, we're going to need recalcitrance to be going down. And that's ultimately what he's going to be going for. Really surprising, the more research you do, the easier it gets to make further improvements. It's kind of hard. So he does give us, 6 arguments, and I think they split into 3 types. The first 3 things he says in support of this view are as plausible as you'll get in this area. But precisely because they're plausible, I think it's not so plausible to go from these to the singularity hypothesis. The first thing he says is AI can make content improvements to its own software, and he gives the example of training on larger data sets. Good idea. We've done that a lot lately. Of course, we're starting to run out of data. So he says we could use the entire Library of Congress. Yeah, we're pretty much there. We're going to the entire internet, and maybe we can go a little bit further. Not entirely clear how that's meant to carry us to a singularity. In particular, you might think it didn't. Then he says, okay, AI can improve its hardware. Yeah, AI can improve its hardware. Humans can improve its hardware. This is not, disputed, but not yet an argument for singularity. This is common ground. And then he says something interesting. He says, well, if we reach AI through one specific path, namely whole brain emulation, once, we're working up to the first whole brain emulation, that's hard. But once we get a new technology, we can make it a little bit better. We can make 100 brains. We can make the algorithm more efficient. This is true of every technology. Once you finally get it, you can make it a little bit better very quickly. This is a known phenomenon. What's known about it, it doesn't usually give us a hyperbola to 8 orders of magnitude better. So the question is why it's supposed to do that here. So, okay, this is all plausible, but like not going to get you a singularity without more argument. He does say 2 things that I think would get you the singularity hypothesis, but precisely because they could, I think they're pretty question begging. So first, he says a bunch of programmers in a basement could make a single clever software insight one day. This is like the anti-Sutton view, and the software insight would take it to singularity. This is a restatement of the view, except he's made it worse, right? Because what's supposed to be plausible about the view is we have recursive self-improvement. And he's just taken out the recursion and said we could have one shot. And he's also taken the improvement of hardware out, and it could just be one shot in software. Okay, it could, but this is just a, a less plausible restatement of the view. Then he says, well, AI, right now it's not doing so great because its domain general reasoning abilities aren't great. This was 2014, remember, but once its domain general reasoning abilities get good, when we're starting to get there, then we have singularity. Okay, maybe, but why? He does say one thing that is interesting for two reasons. One is because it's specific, and the other is because it's demonstrably wrong. There are very few statements in this area that are specific enough to be empirically analyzed. So it's really important when you get an empirical statement to ask, is it right or is it wrong? And this is demonstrably, we've already seen twice wrong. In a really surprising way, because Nick Bostrom really reads his science before he writes. So he says, here's what happened in Moore's law. Constant optimization power, the same amount of quality-related research effort in the 60s and in now. We didn't get any more research inputs. And we also saw exponential growth in intelligence over this period. Now, if that's right, you solve his equation and you need to have that recalcitrance was declining, i.e. a fixed percentage change improvement actually got easier in terms of research inputs than it was before. It's the opposite of diminishing research productivity. So that's what he claims happened in Moore's law. He really didn't claim it. He said, suppose optimization power applied to the system is roughly constant prior to the system becoming capable of contributing substantially to its own design, and this leads to doubling every 18 months. Okay, every 24, not 18, but fine. Parentheses, this would be roughly in line with historical improvement rates for Moore's law, combined with software advances. This, if achieved by means of roughly constant optimization power, entails recalcitrance declining as the inverse of system power. So one thing I could have picked on here, which I haven't, is we're doing a clicking and dragging over many orders of magnitude isn't good. He's saying what happened over Moore's law is before self-improvement, and then we'll just project that same trend forward over many, many orders of magnitude. If you ask me in one sentence what goes wrong with the singularity, is clicking and dragging a curve too far is like a bad way of going. But let's just focus on what he's clicking and dragging, because he's twice wrong about the thing he's clicking and dragging. So first he says we had constant research inputs every year. We did not have constant research inputs. We had 18 times more research inputs over the years. And then he said we had exponential growth in intelligence. Well, if we're lucky, we got exponential hardware growth. That might be fizzling out. And we saw it's probably hard to get exponential intelligence growth from exponential hardware growth. So here we'd be pushing back once, possibly twice against the model. If we only make one of these pushbacks, we get back to the exponential growth regime. And if we make both of them, we're in the Moore's law skeptics, we're in sub-exponential growth. And so this is really not a great model for Bostrom, I think, to be pursuing. I want to talk a little bit about policy as this finishes up. And something I want to start with is a reminder that there's really two visions of the singularity. That recently we've gotten a very pessimistic vision of what could happen in singularity, but originally this was a transhumanist vision. They wanted to build the singularity. This was going to be the new utopia that brought humanity past our biological selves. So on the one hand, we have the optimists, the accelerationists, Beth Bezos is their leader, but also the singularitarians, like the young Eliezer Yudkowsky. They want to build the singularity in order to get to Yudkowsky. And also you have the pessimists. They think once we get the singularity, we get extinction or permanent disempowerment or mind crimes are really great. Suffering is, the later post-singularitarians, the transhumanists go through the rationalists, effective altruists, long-termists, and these people are the ones who are pushing back. I think the singularity hypothesis is false, and if that's right, I think these people are going to be giving us some policy guidance that isn't right. But it's important to separate the policy guidance across these views because they're giving us very, very different policy guidance. So optimistic visions of singularities. People really said this. This is really Eliezer Yudkowsky, is one of the leading long-termists and rationalists, is really Ray Kurzweil, one of the two big names in the singularity. I don't want to hold everybody in the singularity to this, but these are not random people I'm quoting. Kurzweil says after the singularity, aging and illness will be reversed, pollution will be stopped, hunger and poverty will be solved. Nanotech, this is the Eric Drexler thing that never got off the ground, will make it possible to create virtually any physical product using inexpensive information processes, and will turn ultimately even death into a soluble problem. Remember, originally it was nanotech that was going to kill us, and the singularity, Yudkowsky wanted to build it to save us from the nanobots. Here's the young Yudkowsky. So disclaimer, he has repudiated this. The young Yudkowsky said, I've had it. I've had it with crack houses, dictatorships, torture chambers, old age, disease, paralysis, world hunger. 150 sentient beings, that's actually just humans dying every day. None of this is necessary. We're screaming in pain. Our planet will probably be scorched to a cinder or converted into goo by the very same global warming these systems are going to make. We don't know what the heck is going on. Okay, so this is great. Until here, I'm with him. And I thought he was going to say, so let's solve climate change. Let's solve poverty. Let's solve. And remember, this is what effective altruists were doing before they went long-termist. Here's the solution. The singularity will solve these problems. I declare reaching the singularity as fast as possible to be the interim meaning of life, the temporary definition of good, and the foundation until further notice of my ethical system. So then he goes and builds a research institute that was aimed at building the singularity, except they weren't actually going to code. They were just going to do some very general research, and then we'd get a singularity. So from these people, we get some policy suggestions that I think we should push back on. And the first and most egregious is you talk about the world's problems, about poverty, about hunger, about climate change, things minus climate change that they used to be investing resources into. You talk about problems within the movement, sexual harassment, discrimination, racism. They say, okay, even these problems, how are we going to solve them? In the interim, don't bother. Just make the singularity. The singularity is going to solve anything, and anything that happens before the immaterial, the singularity is just dust. It's too small to care about. This is not, I think, the solution to the world's problems, something you want to push back against. Also, remember, there's a consciousness preservation argument. So if you go to rationalist circles in Silicon Valley, or you go to Oxford, you're going to see people toting Alcor medals. And the point is, look, if you think we're going to have a singularity, we can hope to upload our consciousness into the singularity and live forever. Two ways to do it. You can freeze and hope anybody, in the future has a really good scanning technology, or you can gamble that our scans are good enough. You can slice your brain as fine as you want, and then scan the slices and hope that scan is good enough. I would go for freezing, but whichever one you want. The argument is, put a lot of money into Alcor. A lot of these people have. And also windfall clauses. You've seen advocacy. So not even the technological singularity, just the weaker economic component. If we really do get this runaway, what happens? Two things. One, a bunch of tech companies quickly own 99.999% of the economy. And two, labor's ability to demand wages falls below subsistence. So if you have these fears, what do? We legally bind companies now to redistribute profits above a certain level so that this economic catastrophe doesn't happen. So if the singularity isn't right, this approach to solving the world's problems by building the singularity is not good. Consciousness preservation, you might want to do it, you might not want to do it, but it's certainly less attractive the less optimistic you are about the singularity. And windfall clauses, I'm a socialist, I love them, but this justification that we're literally going to lose control of the entire economy becomes less attractive. On the other hand, we have pessimistic visions. This is the later Yudkowsky, where roughly AI is going to do us in. And the classic arguments, Yudkowsky leans very heavily on this. Bostrom leans very heavily on this. I'd be happy to give you text. I've had people tell me they didn't. They did. They start with the singularity process. Self-improving AI is going to go orders of magnitude more intelligent than the average human very quickly. And the upshot here again is we don't have to worry about how it's going to kill us. We just have to ask what it would want. Then we've got very plausibly orthogonality. In principle, any super intelligent system could have any goal that you want. Okay, fair enough. So in principle, the system could have any value that we want. As Cameron said, of course, this in itself is a double-edged sword, because if all we know is that in principle it could have any set of values in value space, is probably not, for Gallo-style reasons, an argument for AI risk is probably a worry against it. So you need to couple this with something like an instrumental convergence thesis. So classic statement of instrumental convergence, there are two things here, not one. I think Cameron made this point really nicely. Bunch of instrumental values, power, resources can be identified, which are convergent, in the sense that getting these things would make me more likely to get other things I value. Fair enough, I want paper clips, I want happiness, I want love, I want health, I want any of these things, power and money are going to help. Implying, this is our second turning word that is, I think, not warranted, implying these instrumental values are likely to be pursued, and pursued to the degree that, we completely vanish as a species. Okay, so we can talk about that another time. I don't really have developed thoughts about instrumental convergence, but that's supposed to get us, in practice, AI's going to want us to be likely to have values that are incompatible with us. So there's lots of things you can say about this argument, but like one really natural thing to say is the singularity hypothesis is false. If it's false, you don't just have to tell me about motivations, you have to tell me very concretely how we're meant to die and what the level of risk is. And so we get a very different kind of an argument when we shape the singularity forward. Okay, I think I want to stop there, maybe take a quick break and then pause for questions.
All right, so we'll start the Q&A at 4 o'clock precisely, and if you the rest of them.
I'm not going to record Q&A unless anyone wants me to record.